Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Renew webinar series on Europe in the World. I'm Kari Otteburn of the Leuven Centre for Global Governance Studies, and I will be your host and moderator. Today, we are joined by Professor Dr. Jennifer Clapp, who will discuss her new book, Titans of Industrial Agriculture: How a Few Giant Corporations Came to Dominate the Farm Sector and Why It Matters, recently published by MIT Press. Jennifer Clapp is the Canada Research Chair in Global Food Security and Sustainability, as well as professor at the School of Environment, Resources, and Sustainability at the University of Waterloo. Her research focuses on the global governance of problems that arise at the intersection of the global economy, food security and food systems, and the natural environment. She's a member of the International Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems and previously served as vice chair of the steering committee of the high-level panel of experts on food security and nutrition of the UN Committee on World Food Security. It's quite a title. Also joining us today as expert discussant is Professor Dr. Janina Grabs. Janina is Associate Professor of Sustainability Research at the University of Basel, Switzerland, leading the Sustainability Research Group. Her research focuses on the transnational governance of sustainability in global value chains and the options of states, firms, non-governmental organizations, and other actors to improve the environmental and social sustainability of commodity production. She's also the author of Selling Sustainability Short: The Private Governance of Labor and the Environment in the Coffee Sector, which was published in 2020 by Cambridge University Press. We'll begin today's webinar with a presentation by Jennifer of about 30 minutes, and then we'll turn to Janina to kick off the discussion by offering some reflections and asking some questions, and Jennifer will have an opportunity to respond. Then we'll turn to questions from you, the audience. So please feel free to send those questions for me at any point during the webinar using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom window. I will collect your questions to share with Jennifer during the audience Q&A following the presentations. You should see that button just at the bottom of the window. Any questions you have for the speakers, just go ahead and type them in there. Before we begin, just a few words about the eRenew project. The EU Research and Education Network on Europe and the World, or eRenew as we call it, is an Erasmus Jean Monnet network bringing together 19 higher education institutions from Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, with the goal of improving knowledge and enhancing debate on the EU's role in a never-changing world. So on behalf of eRenew, I would like to really thank Jennifer and Janina for joining us today. And now it is my great pleasure to pass the floor over to Jennifer. You have the floor.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction, Kari. And also, I look forward to hearing Janina's comments. And I'm going to take this moment to share my screen. And just to double check, you can see the presentation. Excellent. Okay. So thank you very much. And I'm really delighted to be here today to talk about my new book, Titans of Industrial Agriculture. And it's basically a book about the 4 agricultural input industries, including farm machinery like plows and tractors, the fertilizer sector, the seed industry, and the pesticide industry. And the book sets out to interrogate how we went from having these 4 farm inputs that make up industrial agriculture as we call it today. And those inputs were not even market commodities 200 years ago. And today they're controlled by just a handful. Each of those inputs is controlled by just a handful of firms. And so the book is seeking to understand that process and also what the consequences are to that transition to industrial agriculture. Now, I only have 30 minutes and I'm going to try my best to stay within that time frame. And so that's obviously not enough time for a detailed blow by blow of a book that's over 400 pages and spanning 13 chapters. So I'm just going to map out the really broad themes, talk about the concepts, and give a few examples. And then I really look forward to any questions that might want to go a bit deeper. But in terms of a roadmap for what I'm going to do today, what I'm going to say today, I'm going to talk a little bit about why I wrote this book. I'm going to give a really high-level overview of the main arguments, and then talk a bit about the lessons for policy and for scholarship. And I'm going to say the most about point number 2, but I do want to say something about the image that's on the screen right now. This is a combine thresher that was made actually in Waterloo, Ontario, which is where I am sitting today. And in the course of researching this book, I was delighted to open a historical article, a PDF, and find the name Waterloo and this sunshine factory in the first words of an article. And I discovered that this factory once stood on a road, which I pass every day on my way to work. And I was super delighted to see this connection to where I live and the story that I was talking about. So just to talk about why I wrote this book, I've really been interested for a very long time in corporate power in general and the exercise of that power in food systems. And that interest goes back to my early teaching days in the early to mid 1990s, when agricultural biotechnology was coming on the market, and there was a lot of concern about this new technology. And also the fact that it was controlled by just a few companies. And I would say that in the interim, in the 30 years since, we've seen corporate power grow, very much so in the wider economy through, for example, the rise of big tech firms, the rise of concentrated insurance industry, pharmaceutical industry, asset management companies. And there's just been growing concern about monopoly power and associated widening of inequality in the economy, and how that spills over into politics and wider aspects of our lives, including the social and ecological dimensions. But I was, really paying attention all this time to agriculture and noticing that in the broader focus on big tech, there was a lot less attention to agriculture. And I really wanted to, in writing this book, dive a bit deeper into understanding what was going on in the agriculture sector, and whether there were, because it has a much longer history than big tech, and then understand what the lessons might be for the wider political economy. So I had been thinking about writing this book for a long time, but was prompted after 2015, when we saw a rapid suite of mergers that were happening in the agricultural input sector. And it completely reconfigured the landscape. And it started in late 2015 with a merger between Dow and DuPont. If you recall, they announced they were going to merge and then spin off 3 companies, one of which is called Corteva, which is now their dominant agricultural input company that deals with seeds and chemicals. And shortly after that announcement, there was an announcement that ChemChina was going to buy Syngenta. And then when that merger happened, then that subsequent company was actually purchased and swallowed up by Sinochem, which is the biggest, one of the biggest chemical companies in China. It is the biggest in China. It's one of the biggest in the world. But it didn't stop there. We saw then, after these early mergers, that Bayer announced it was going to purchase Monsanto, and that was completed around it was announced in 2016, completed around 2018. And it still didn't stop there. It wasn't just, what was going on there. What we saw was that as these mergers were taking place and these companies had to get regulatory approval, they were frequently asked to sell some of their assets, and BASF, one of the other big chemical companies, stood ready to buy up those assets. And then at the same time, we saw a massive merger in the fertilizer industry, where 2 big fertilizer companies, both based in Canada, Agrium and Potash Corporation, merged and formed a new fertilizer company called Nutrien, which is one of the biggest in the world. And then also in the background, while all of these mergers were happening, we saw the rise of digital agriculture and digital startups that were being purchased by all these companies, as well as by the farm machinery companies. And so there was this big reconfiguration happening in the sector. And so what we end up with today is around 4 firms dominating in each of these, big sectors. So in seeds and pesticides, and I'll talk about this a little bit, those industries have come together into one set of firms, and they're dominated by 4 companies. And those 4 companies control around 60% of the global seed market and around 70% of the global pesticide sales. But if you dig down deeper, like at the country level, at the national level, these companies control around 80%, for example, of soy, maize, and canola seeds in North America and in many other countries. And we also see the top 4 farm machinery companies in the world controlling around 50% of that global market. But again, it's more pronounced at the national level. So for example, John Deere alone controls around 60% of heavy-duty tractor sales in the US and Canada. And then we also have a group of the top fertilizer companies. We don't have good data on their global control, but we know that in specific domestic markets, they have a fair bit of control. So for example, 4 companies control 100% of North American potash fertilizer manufacturer, and just 2 companies mosaic and nutrient control around 75% of North American nitrogen fertilizer. And it's different in different countries because fertilizer is a weird sector, and I don't have time to go into that, but we can come back to it. But basically, I was trying to understand, like, how did we get to this situation, and is it something that we should worry about? So in terms of the approach that I took in writing the book, I was really inspired by some of the early writing of Louis Brandeis, who was a Supreme Court justice in the US and a big antitrust advocate. And he wrote in 1914, size, we are told, is not a crime, but size may at least become noxious by reason of the means through which it was attained or the uses to which it is put. So in other words, Brandeis was worried about how the bigness of firms can occur through mergers and acquisitions, and how the power that they acquire through getting big can be quite problematic. And his fear was that bigness risked undermining democracy. And that sounds familiar today, doesn't it? When we have this big concern about the rise of big tech and communication companies undermining democracy, he was worried about it at the time based on other industries that were consolidating. That includes in agricultural inputs, railways, oil sector, steel sector, etc. But in his early work, Brandeis called on scholars to understand how bigness occurred so that policies could address it more effectively. And so, inspired by Brandeis's work, I wanted to understand the causes and consequences of bigness in the agricultural input sector, because no one had really done this yet in a big historical assessment of these patterns and what was happening. And that story spans back hundreds of years. And I did take the time to try and understand this process. And so what did I find? First, just to say, this book took me over 5 years to research and write. I'm a bit embarrassed how long it took. In fact, I probably started it around 2016, and it only, is published this year. But what I found resulted in a three-part argument, and I can only give the broad brushstrokes of it here. But I just want to say, like, I was trying to understand the firms, and you see some of them here, these early firms on the slide, and you may recognize some of these companies, obviously, like John Deere. You might recognize Dow or, Pioneer, but some of these companies, they don't exist in this particular name today, but they are part of other companies that are the dominant ones. And so there's this long lineage of these early firms that have been gradually swallowed up by the ones that have remained. And what's interesting is that, if you look at what industry says about itself, these firms argue that they rose to the top simply because they were more innovative, they were more efficient, they were, basically grew large through hard work, and they deserve to be where they are. But if we look deeper under the hood, we see the reality is that their bigness is the product of largely mergers and acquisitions, and that a host of factors are at play. And in particular, in the book, I focus on three of them that help us explain the mergers and acquisitions that did take place, how the bigness unfolded in this sector. So I talk about these three factors. One is market dynamics, and obviously that's really important. And the image on the slide here is of the McCormick Reaper Works, which was absolutely massive. As you can see, the scale of this factory facility in Chicago. And this was the version that was after the Chicago fire. They moved to an even bigger location and made this huge factory. And this was an image from 1902, just on the eve of a massive merger of 7 farm machinery companies that ended up controlling 85% of the US farm machinery market at the time. And a big part of their argument for at the time why they needed to be bigger was because they could achieve economies of scale. If you have a giant facility, you can be more efficient per unit of production, the bigger the firm gets. But, it's important, of course, but not, it's not just efficiencies. You can get too big. In fact, Brandeis talked about the curse of bigness, and others have picked up on this concept, meaning you can get too big so that you actually become inefficient. But this wasn't the only sort of factor that was going on and explaining these mergers and acquisitions. Most of the firms that ended up in the dominant places and buying up other firms had privileged access to finance. They were hobnobbing with the wealthy monopolists of the era. So, John D. Rockefeller involved in this merger, owning many of the shares. and that kind of access to finance. And it's continued to be really, really important in the current era. So when Dow and DuPont merged, for example, there were these activist investors running hedge funds who bought up significant shares of both those firms and pushed them to restructure. And also investor pressures, really, really important, similar to, hedge fund pressures, but we've now seen this rise of shareholder value in the economy and always looking for higher returns. And this pressure has really come to bear on many companies, pushing them towards mergers and acquisitions so they can increase their market share, so they can increase their profits. And this is happening as we're seeing the rise of common ownership and financialization in the global economy more broadly, and definitely it's impacting the food and agriculture sector. So these kind of factors are really important in explaining bigness, but of course, that's not everything. A second big set of drivers I talk about in the book are the technological drivers, because the firms at the top were not simply more clever, as they would have you say. I mean, some clearly were. They were doing some innovations that they were able to get, IP protection for. But many of them simply ended up at the right place at the right time, and they were able to capitalize on technological change, because that change wasn't always happening within the farm sector. So just to give some examples, I mean, these transformative innovations were happening both inside and outside the sector. The rise of the mechanical reaper in the first place in the 1830s, yes, that was an innovation in the farm sector. But when we had, moved to diesel-powered tractors, for example, that came from the rise of the internal combustion engine, which was outside of the farm sector. But they were able to take that innovation into the sector and really capitalize on it. And also, many of these firms were able to, especially those that were more innovative, benefit from IP protection. So that lure of patent protection for their new technologies encouraged this kind of consolidation, because they were often trying to buy up other firms that might have had a technology that they were trying to get access to, or they were trying to, expand their size so that they could invest more in research and development. And we can talk about the kinds of research and development they do, and I'll come back to that. And they also benefited from what we might call technological lock-ins, because increasingly, as industrial agriculture was emerging, and this process really began in the 1840s, but eventually by the 1940s, we saw the technologies of farm machinery, seeds, fertilizers, and pesticides increasingly became locked in with each other, so that it became a package of inputs that farmers adopted together, and it was hard to unadopt any one of those. And so that continued market demand for these goods and gave capital to these firms to engage in further consolidation. And then the third factor I talk about in the book is the policy context. Many of the firms that grew really big had direct government support, either in terms of subsidies or handouts from government technological research and development. I mean, we can point to the hybridization of seeds. I've got the little picture on the slide here, but that research was initially done by the US government and basically handed over to private companies who were able to profit and capitalize on it. Similar processes in nitrogen synthesis for fertilizers, as well as for chemical pesticides. And so this was a big factor, that government support. There was also the passage of policies in many countries, especially we can say in the US, which was an origin of the big takeoff of this kind of industrial agriculture, that encouraged its adoption. We can point to the Agricultural Adjustment Act of the 1930s, for example, which was asking farmers to grow on smaller acreages, and farmers wanted to maintain their production. And so they were like doing heavy industrialization to get more crops out of a smaller plot of land. And that really encouraged this adoption of industrial agriculture. Plus Henry Wallace, whose picture is also on the slide here, as that Secretary of Agriculture, really promoted hybrid seeds, even though he was the CEO of a company selling hybrid seeds. We talk about conflict of interest. So it's pretty huge in this instance. And then also we can talk about the quality, the robustness or the weakness of antitrust or competition policies. They also played a role. I mean, some of the earliest mergers took place because the first antitrust rules in the US, for example, outlawed monopoly. That means one company controlling the entire market. And so and it outlawed trusts. In other words, cooperation between firms. So firms were like looking around saying, okay, we can't collaborate with each other and we can't own everything. So why don't we just merge and get bigger and have a giant share of the market, but not 100%. Those kind of approaches to policy had these perverse outcomes, which was more consolidation. And that continues today with the weakening of antitrust since the rise of neoliberalism. So there's a lot of, things swirling around here that led to the rise of these giant firms. And I'm just going to quickly run through these next slides just to show, because I was having trouble keeping track of all the companies at the beginning and how we ended up at the end. So I made some maps, that this is a process that happened from the 1830s in farm machinery and takes us all the way to today. But you can see there were many more firms in the early days, and there was this pattern of mergers and acquisitions over the years that led us to the situation where we have 4 giant companies. And this is just the main ones that I was able to outline here. There were many, many more. Similar process going on in fertilizer, which was a little more complicated because fertilizer is a weird sector because there's 3 nutrients, and its origins also go back to the 1830s and 40s. There's nitrogen, phosphates, and potassium, and come from all kinds of sources, from ground up bones and blood from livestock slaughter to guano to cartels for the mining of potash and phosphorus. There was a lot going on in this sector, but we see there was still a steady pace of consolidation. Similarly in seeds and pesticides. And what's interesting in this sector is what we saw in the 1970s to 90s was chemical companies starting to buy up seed companies. And this was because the rise of agricultural biotechnology, which really tied these 2 inputs even more closely together, because seeds were being engineered to resist specific pesticides, namely glyphosate. And if we take the seed industry, this is a really simplified version of a map of this consolidation process, because there were many, many seed companies. But I just wanted to show where each of them ended up. It's not like they simply disappeared or went out of business. They got bought up by someone else and became part of the operations of the dominant firms. So if we look today, we see this process that happened was the seed and chemical companies became one set of companies, which we tend to refer to the ag biotech companies. We saw consolidation in fertilizer globally across nutrients, and then from retail, from mining and processing all the way to retail. And then farm machinery has also been increasingly consolidated with integrated production, not that dissimilar to the automobile industry. And as I mentioned, this purchase of these startups is happening for digital farming and biological gene editing. These startups are now being bought up by nearly all the companies across the sectors. The pace of these mergers and acquisitions is, striking. I was only able to capture some of them that happened in the last couple of years, but this is a big area where these firms are now investing. So while we see these big mega mergers on occasion, and we think of them as, the mergers, it's going on every single day. And so what we're seeing is now an increased convergence across the entire input sector, where the fertilizer industry, seeds and chemicals, and farm machinery are all moving towards partnerships across the sectors, especially with this rise of gene editing and digital agriculture. So we may not have seen the end of these giant mergers. They could continue. So a second big argument that I talk about in the book is then, okay, if we understand now how the firms got so big through these mergers and acquisitions, like, how do they benefit? What do they do when they get big? And also the third argument is about what are the consequences. So I'll just talk briefly here and give a few examples. And what I argue is that when these firms become really dominant, they gain different kinds of power that enable them to stay big. So what are these kinds of power? They gain the power to shape markets in a way that is to their benefit, because they are so dominant. And, this draws on ideas of market power coming from the field of economics, that they can shape the contours of the market in ways that benefit them. They gain the power to shape technology. So they're able to push technological directions when there's only a few large firms that dominate. They have a big say over what industrial agriculture looks like. And they also then have the power to shape policy and governance because they have this size and they have that kind of ability to get the ear of policymakers because of their structural power. And if this looks familiar to the first part of the argument, it's because it is. They actually use those same factors that allowed them to get big to exert their power in ways that let them stay big. So I'll just talk about a few examples. In terms of shaping markets, there are all kinds of ways in which the big firms that dominate in the agricultural input sector can shape markets. And this is usually when the biggest firms control over 40% of the market, and especially if they control over 60% of the market, they can control supply and demand conditions to the extent that they can gain excess profits. So just to give a few brief examples here, John Deere, for example, was recently sued by the US government for dominating the repair market for tractors. And I talk about this issue in the book because there's a big right to repair movement where farmers are really annoyed that they can't repair their own farm machinery. And Deere has required farmers to sign end user license agreements that say that only licensed Deere repair shops and dealers can actually conduct repairs on these machines. So it's preventing small scale repair shops from getting this business. It's preventing farmers from taking control and repairing their own tractors, but it's giving that market to Deere, and that enables them to charge higher prices because of that requirement. So that's been a big issue, and they're being sued over in breach of antitrust rules for this. Another example, just briefly, is on the fertilizer industry. I put a graphic here of the rise in the net profits of the top fertilizer companies over the past 5 or 6 years, and you can see it's really gone up quite sharply, especially during the turmoil that happened first from COVID and then the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And farmers were really annoyed about the rapid increase in fertilizer prices because they saw it as these companies taking advantage of a situation in order to profiteer. And they could do this under the cover of general chaos in the marketplace. And normally, if their net profit and profit ratios were the same, then you could just say, well, their costs went up. That's why prices rose. But in this case, their net profits rose up and their net profit ratios also increased sharply. So it does appear that this has been an issue, and farmers have been rightly quite annoyed by it. And another example is the pesticide industry paying loyalty rebates to retailers. They've also recently been sued by the US government over this kind of practice. And what they basically have been doing is paying retailers of farm inputs not to carry generic versions of their chemicals that are off patent now, so that they can continue to benefit from sales of their products even after the patents have run out. And that's plainly illegal, to pay someone not to carry a product because you want to see your product on the shelf. And so these kind of practices are ways in which these firms can extend their bigness. They're using their power to extend their market share. They're also shaping technologies. There are lots of ways in which they shape technological trajectories in the sector. So for example, the development of herbicide-resistant seeds, I already mentioned that example, which was key for agricultural biotechnology in the 1990s. And that really changed the landscape of industrial agriculture. And this, it's been really difficult, for example, for farmers to access non-genetically modified seeds for certain crops. They're pushing a technological trajectory. Also, the rise of digital farming and genome editing, I've already mentioned this, but it's also shaping technology. These are kinds of technologies that could result, for example, in some improvements, sustainability improvements, let's say more efficient use of chemicals and fertilizers, or editing new crops that, for example, have higher yields or are more drought resistant. But the reality is that most of the research and development that's going into digital farming and genome editing is about continuing to rely on pesticides. And so they're engineering seeds with new methods to still be resistant to the spray of chemical herbicides. It's not necessarily moving us beyond the problems that are associated. It's, in a way, digging it in a little bit more. And that's a way that they're shaping technological trajectories. And the companies are also playing a big role in shaping policy and governance. And again, they do this through a number of strategies. Obviously, they engage in lobbying and revolving door appointments, engage in partnerships, sponsoring scientific studies. They have discursive influence. I mean, there's been a lot of work around the exercise of corporate power in policy, both domestically and internationally. And this is clearly going on. I could spend all day talking about just this slide, but I'm not going to. But just to say, I found interestingly, Bayer has now a transparency report that they publish on their own lobbying, and they revealed they spent 50 million euro globally lobbying in 2023. And this is going on everywhere by all the companies, like the fertilizer lobby in Canada, for example, when Canada was rewriting regulations on fertilizer, met on average with the regulators every 2 days. This constant engagement is enabling them to shape the policy and governance frameworks within which they must operate, and they can encourage governments to pass regulations that help them continue their profits. So this, brings me to the summary of what's going on, or what are the consequences of this kind of power. And this is the third argument of the book, is about those kind of consequences. There are enormous social and ecological costs to the exercise of this kind of power in the sector by the big dominant firms. It lends that kind, market power, technology power, and political power to those firms that can affect the prices paid by farmers for their inputs. It can create barriers to entry for new entrants into the market. It can focus innovations only on the most profit-oriented technologies, and it can give undue corporate influence in the policy process. And in the book, I try to talk about what are some of the direct costs of this concentration, and then the wider costs associated with a model of agriculture that they have brought. So I realize I'm coming up to time, and I'm just going to quickly go through these couple of slides. But to say the direct costs of corporate power, we see higher costs threatening farmer livelihoods and making food more expensive. We see farmers losing autonomy, and some would say they're being de-skilled due to the lock-ins that are happening across the sector. Their space for maneuver is becoming tighter and tighter regarding these different kinds of chemicals and seeds and machinery that they're dealing with. Also, we're seeing the pursuit of profit-oriented innovations and technological lock-in. It's making it harder to transition to sustainable farming systems, because the big companies, they dominate research and development in agricultural inputs, yet they're not putting a lot of effort into researching agroecology, for example, because it won't sell them, it won't sell their products. And so if the state doesn't step in to provide that kind of research and development, we're kind of relying on scholars like us to do that work. And obviously we're not getting enough of the funds and having enough of a say in doing that. We need more effort towards that. And also we're seeing a continued reliance on this herbicide-centric model of agriculture, which is a threat to environment and health. So there are these direct costs of corporate power, but there are also wider costs of industrial farming model. And this slide, I have a lot of pictures of old books, and you might be wondering why these are here, but I put them here because these costs of industrial agriculture for the environment and society have long been recognized, and there have been early critics that didn't win the argument, but their insights have been extremely important. And I wanted to feature that and highlight that because it's something that I really found interesting in researching the book. Questions of displacement from the land, Black farmers, Indigenous farmers, this has long been recognized. Anna Rochester, in her book, Why Farmers Are Poor, really pointed to these problems in the early 1940s. Soil damage and fertility loss. I mean, Paul Sears and Faulkner, whose name I can't remember right now, Edward Faulkner, they wrote about soil damage and fertility loss from overplowing and from the use of chemical fertilizers, as did Sir Albert Howard in The War in the Soil. And so there were early critics, and Eve Balfour also writing about biodiversity loss in the soil. And there were other scholars as well writing about biodiversity loss from genetic uniformity that came from the hybridization of seeds. There was also concern about toxic pollution and pest resistance. We know this from Rachel Carson's work in 1962. And we often say, you know, she was one of the first critics of industrial agriculture, but she wasn't. She was actually more on the tail end when we look at some of these earlier works. And now increasingly, a lot of these early authors were not really aware of climate change, but we are now recognizing the climate impacts of all of these technologies that are being used on the farm. And it's vital that we pay more attention. So I'm just going to come to my final slides here and talk a little bit about some of the policy lessons that arise from the work. And I talk about these in the last chapter of the book, that we really need stronger competition policies to open up alternatives for more competitive markets, but also to address, you know, some of the things that are going on in the sector, like a digitalized and financialized agriculture, just like a digitalized and financialized world. Those older policies are not capable of addressing the complexities of the situation today. They need to be updated to address these ways in which these corporations can take hold and have power over the system. We also need more public support, as I already mentioned, for alternative agricultural models such as agroecology to break lock-ins and that are not so reliant on these corporate inputs. And policies are required to counter the corporate capture of food systems governance. I'm not going to dwell on these. Hopefully we can come back to talk about them, because they're all big areas and they're separate from each other. And even the competition policy question, it's outside of the agriculture sector. It's a bigger agenda. And then just quickly, the key scholarly takeaways. In terms of the book and what it brings, corporate power in the sector has deep roots. That's a big message of the book, and it reveals important insights about patterns of control and sustainability within food systems. Examining the interaction of market technology and policy factors, as I do together, I think gives a more nuanced understanding of the sources of power in food systems, and that food systems transformation requires policies to address corporate power. And here I have an image from the Grangers. It's a poster from the 1870s, and I really like the image. But you know, this was one of the early groups that was trying to tackle corporate power in North America at that time, because there was a lot of concern about these processes in the 1860s and 1870s and farmers losing control. But that movement, while robust and wide-ranging, was eventually shut down because they were up against this huge power. And it's sort of a cautionary tale to, I would like to say, I hope we're not going to be in a similar situation where, you know, the conversation stops for 20 or 30 years. We need to have that conversation now. And so with that, I'll just say thank you very much. And sorry that I spoke over, but only about 4 minutes. So hopefully that's okay.
Absolutely fine. Thank you so much for this very interesting presentation. I especially loved all of the imagery going on behind behind your or on your slides. That was very fun. Unexpected details, but you covered a lot of ground in a short period of time, so very nice. We'll pass now directly over to Janina for questions and comments from her side.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks, Jennifer, for writing this book and presenting it and giving so much insight in, again, a very short amount of time. So I just want to start out with stressing what an excellent contribution this is, especially because it provides a really rare balance and integration between sort of business history, political economy, and food system studies. And these are areas of scholarship that very often don't necessarily get integrated in this way, especially the whole business history, mergers and acquisitions literature. I've dabbled in some of it myself, and it is also it's very far removed from sort of where we usually go in terms of thinking about sustainability of food systems and really being able to draw out, like at every step of the way, what are the social and environmental costs of these mergers, of these business practices, was really enlightening and insightful. I also really loved this opportunity, basically, by looking at the import sector, that you can start, like with a history book, it's always the question of where do you start? And for this book, like the decision of saying, let's start at the beginning. Let's start when there was first this the movement towards selling these things that were usually produced by farmers themselves, right? Inputs, fertilizers, seeds didn't get commercialized, as Jennifer mentions, until quite late in the history of agriculture generally. And so starting from that point and then really tracing how firms that started up then very early on grew throughout the growth of the industrialized way of producing food and the industrialized food system was really interesting. And I think it then also that having this long view brings out some patterns that we may otherwise not see. For instance, we may treat new innovations like genetic technology or now sort of GMO, gene editing, all these things as something novel. But if we look at the fact that there have been technological innovations in the food sector and agricultural sector, starting from the mechanized harvester and the ways in which companies innovated and responded to these innovations is quite consistent throughout time, is really interesting. Another thing that I thought was cool to see throughout the book was tracing, again, the history of industrialized agriculture and specifically these boom and bust cycles that we see throughout different time periods and how they then interlink with the boom and bust cycles of the input sectors, but also that both boom times as well as bust times provide some motivation for actually corporate consolidation, mergers and acquisitions. So in the boom times, you can take advantage of opportunities, you can acquire firms that are sort of at the cusp of innovation. And during the bust cycles, you want to cut costs, you want to become leaner, bring together R&D departments, et cetera. So both, like whatever is happening, it seems to be contributing to big ag becoming bigger. And so this is also quite curious to see. I also appreciated the emphasis on the extent to which input companies from the very beginning had something to say about aspirational ways of seeing the food system, right? So we've seen this quite strongly within the discourse around food security, sustainable food systems. I actually remember when I was just an undergrad, like stumbling into this conference on global food security and really expecting these extremely progressive perspectives and then being dumbfounded that it was sponsored by Syngenta and that it was pushing this very productivist view of agriculture. And so seeing these type of influences from the very start, but also growing in intensity and sort of in power over time, and now culminating also with the influences in the UN Food System Summit, et cetera, was also quite interesting. And I'll close with two other things that I found new and exciting about this book. The first one is the extreme attention to detail. So it's so meticulously researched, going back to original sources. And in her foreword, Jennifer mentions that she decided to keep some of these details in, even if they made the book long, because they were so fascinating to her. And I can just sort of amplify that they're fascinating also to the readers. So I had like a couple of examples from just the fertilizer space, the fact that the bones of the bisons that were culled in the 1800s in the Great Plains actually then were used for bone-based fertilizers and was one of the key input sources of fertilizers in the 1800s. Was fascinating. It was fascinating that, well, we know, or some of us know, that there was this use of basically bird excrement, guano, as fertilizer, but it was also really interesting to look into and think about who actually was producing this, as in who was mining this guano, and that this went back to slave labor and indentured laborers. I didn't know that there was a war over fertilizers, the nitrate war, the War of the Pacific, between Peru, Bolivia, and Chile to really corner that market and that resource. And then the fact that the patent for this new synthetic way of producing nitrogen, the Haber-Bosch process, was basically squeezed out of BASF as part of World War II reparation payments. Like all these small details that really show us how this sector and the agricultural industry in and of itself grew alongside world events and was really tightly integrated with these world events was fascinating. And then the fact that Jennifer ended up with a very extensive conclusion on where do we go from here in policy recommendations. I was sort of, as I was finishing the book, I was really hoping that we would also have this forward-looking view and going into quite a lot of details on, as she presented, these avenues of rethinking competition policy, rethinking corporate political influence, trying to get more transparency and accountability, and really reshaping our policy environment and public support for these alternative agricultural models gives sort of this sense of hope that not everything is lost and we don't necessarily have this foregone conclusion of having just one giant ag input industry in the future. And that was great. So I'll move to my questions. And I have 4, but if there's other questions from the chat, of course, we can also just like pick and choose. One question that I had was that in this book, the main protagonists that really get a lot of room, and it's good to give them this room, are these input firms, the legislators, and the farmers. And of course, we know that there's also a lot of other actors, corporate actors with a lot of power along the value chain, starting from trading companies to food manufacturers and retailers. And I was wondering, Jennifer, to what extent you observed linkages or interactions between the input firms and those more downstream companies, whether the input firms are mainly just like operating within their own little world, or if there are also, I guess, alliances that you may have not been able to go into for space reasons that we could look into more detail in future work. The second question is kind of similar, and it relates to counter movements. You mentioned in the discussion and in the conclusion quite a bit about like sort of agroecology, but in the main text, these counter movements, they sometimes appear like the Grangers that you mentioned, but they're at the same time as this like rise of industrial agriculture. There was also this rise of the organic movement, right? And did you see them interacting a lot with these companies and pushing back? Like, could you talk a little bit more about the way in which they may have interacted? And then the third question that I had is somewhat on the conceptual side. So when thinking about power, you were looking at this power to shape markets, to shape technology, and to shape policy and governance, which you call sort of market power, technology power, or knowledge power, and then political power. So it's quite this instrumental focus. It's the power to do something. And we have other forms of conceptualizing and thinking about power, including a lot of work that you have done. And I was wondering whether what analytical leverage you felt that these conceptions gave to you that maybe other types of conceptualizations of power, like the direct instrumental discursive and structural, that is more about the means of where power is coming from, may not have given you in this particular book. And then last but not least, in the conclusion, you mentioned the hope that we might be at a turning point moment in terms of calls for more sustainable and just food systems. And you give quite an optimistic account of recent advances, also particularly in the US context with the FTC and Lina Khan. And I was wondering about your perception of the current state of affairs after the election of the Trump administration, and where we go from here, now sort of like a couple of months in the future where a couple of these background factors may have changed. So thank you so much.
Directly turn to you, Jennifer.
Thanks so much, Janina. These are great comments, and I really am glad you appreciated the details in the book, because it was, yeah, it hurt my brain, which I had to, that's why I had to write it all down, so I wouldn't forget. But in terms of your questions, these are really excellent questions. And just to say, yes, in terms of the first question about interactions with other parts of the food supply chain, definitely, like Mosaic was a part of Cargill, and they ended up as one of the biggest, fertilizer companies, because Cargill had purchased them at some point. And these kind of connections were coming in and out the whole time. Like the story that I'm telling, should really have other books adjacent to it that talk about these other points, because the rise of that industrial agriculture in the first place was about selling commodities to Europe for, while it was industrializing and importing wheat and other kinds of crops, and also the rise of the livestock industry. And so the companies that were controlling the grain trade and controlling the livestock industry are also part of the story. And that's where I found it super fascinating that some of the early big fertilizer companies were actually from the livestock industry, because they were using the leftovers. So Armour and Swift, which we think of as meat companies, were actually big fertilizer producers as well. So these connections were coming in and out throughout the analysis. And I really had to I tried to just acknowledge it and then push it away, because I was trying to tell one story. But I agree, we need to go back, and that's why that book ends with even pointing to some of your work, Janina, saying we need to sort of look at all these other parts of food supply chains, because a similar long historical sweep, I think, would be really interesting. In terms of counter movements, yeah, definitely. They appear in different parts of the book. I also mentioned in the 1970s this rise of this low input sustainable agriculture called LISA that was completely squashed by the lobbyists from the fertilizer industry. They didn't like that idea at all. But I have one of my objectives going forward is to work on a project on the critics that happened throughout the whole telling of this story, and to understand in a way like what they said, why their warnings weren't heeded to the extent that they should be, and what lessons we can learn for today. So it's on the agenda, but yeah, they were coming in and out at different points, but I was trying so hard to focus on that corporate story that it was hard to sort of weave everything together without getting unmanageable. But I appreciate the comment. It's something I've really been thinking about. In terms of power, yeah, I really, I would say I use the structural, discursive, and instrumental kinds of power when I talk about the power to shape political policy and governance. But I found that framework wasn't doing enough to sort of engage with economists about market power. And so that's why I really wanted to focus on market power. And also, I was trying to pick up on some work that Robert Faulkner and others had done about the technological power. And I think in the story of inputs, it's really important. But when I look at other sectors, I'm starting to think about it as, it's a kind of power that shapes everyday conditions or material conditions that I think we need to think about in the food system. So I'm working on a paper on that right now, looking at the whole food system and trying to employ, these kinds of ideas. But it was trying to pick up on that market power and the technology power that it was kind of relevant to structural power, but not as explicitly pulled out. So that's what I was trying to do. Yeah, and then hope and optimism. Yeah, I wish, okay, the book was finished before Trump got elected. Obviously, I had to finish the copy edit last August. So that was kind of hard knowing that, I'm talking about some of the stuff happening in the Biden administration with some hope. But it's interesting because some elements of the Trump administration really are skeptical of big power, right? And so like even Steve Bannon I saw a picture the other day of him having lunch with Lena Khan. He's a big fan of hers, as is JD Vance. So, like I think it's still unclear what's going to happen with the Department of Justice lawsuit against John Deere and Syngenta and others. We shall see, but I think it's still a bit early, but I wouldn't say there's a straightforward answer to say we should be pessimistic right now. I'm choosing to remain optimistic. But thank you, Janina. Those are great comments.
Thanks so much. We have quite a number of questions from the audience, so we can jump in. We'll start with the first round, maybe of 4 questions, and see if we have time for any others. The first, it's actually kind of 2 in 1, but it's on smart technologies. So we have one person asking how digital big data AI applications might feed into consolidating corporate dominance further, and what unique vulnerabilities this might present for food security and democracy. And then sort of the flip side of that, we have another person asking about how these smart agricultural technologies might be integrated into current farming systems in a way that might contribute to more sustainable and equitable agriculture. So we have sort of 2 sides of that coin. And then we have a question on policy lessons, some of the policy lessons you were discussing, specifically on competition policies. To what extent would such changes in national competition policies need to be coordinated across borders, given the international nature of many of these problematic business practices, including mergers? Or would it simply require changes to policy in a few or one large markets, the EU or the US? And then in terms of the factors that you discussed, market, technological, and policy advantages that accounted for the domination of these firms, to what extent do you think these are unique to the farm sector, or do they sort of account for how other mega firms, including those existing today, in like the tech industry, for example, take advantage of these advantages and become the way they are? And then a final one is, can you please elaborate on the strategies you witnessed by these companies to influence policymaking and how these have evolved over time, in particular, and if it's the case, the use of litigation strategies? I will start with those and see if we have time for it.
Thanks, Kari, for summarizing those questions, and thanks to the audience for those questions. Those are great questions. I'm going to answer them quickly in case there are further ones that we could, I realize there's very little time left though. In terms of big data and digital technologies, and the 2 questions about, what are the strategies for corporate dominance and what are the potential vulnerabilities or opportunities? And I want to say here that obviously there's been a lot of concern about the rise of digital technologies because it has been one of the factors encouraging some of the most recent consolidation that's happening in the sector. There's a concern about who owns that data. There's a concern about farmer autonomy, ownership, privacy, concerns about sustainability with respect to these technologies because they're being employed often in ways that are digging in an industrial model rather than moving us towards more sustainable farming, even though they're advertised as being more sustainable by the companies themselves. But at the same time, there's also interesting work going on trying to understand, can digital technologies help us to advance an agroecological future? Can we have open access software, apps, platforms that help us move towards not just more efficient use of industrial agriculture, but sharing of resources across farmer groups, connecting producers to markets. There are many different ways in which the technology could be used for good. So I don't want to, come down and say it's all bad or it's all good, but I think it depends on who is controlling the technology. And that's a concern because some of these technologies are not just controlled by these ag companies, but also now increasingly Amazon, Microsoft, and these big cloud platforms. And we have to be concerned about the big data centers and the cloud computing that is using a huge amount of energy, a huge amount of water to basically make decisions that could potentially be made by humans and have long been made by humans. And so is it further de-skilling farmers? So there's a lot of, issues in there, and there's a really good work that's happening in that area. And I think I'm happy to email anyone and point out some of the really cool books and articles that are coming out in that sector right now. Policy lessons, coordination across borders, definitely I call for that in the book. There's already some coordination between competition authorities across borders, and I think there could be more. There could even be an international competition treaty that really, tries to rein in some of the bad practices that can happen, especially among transnational corporations. Are these dynamics unique to the farm sector? Not necessarily. I think what's interesting to me is I was super focused on the farm sector while writing the book, but then stepping back and looking at the history of other sectors, I see so many parallels. And again, I was trying to bring lessons from the agriculture sector to the wider discussion on corporate power. And I do think there's something to say there. Strategies, yeah, litigation stuff, that's been going on since the 40s and 50s. Cyrus McCormick was known for it. I would say when he was a monopolist in the 1850s, his reputation was like that of Elon Musk today. Let's just leave it there. 4 out of 5 Americans were farmers. They needed his equipment to run their daily lives, just like people feel about, big tech. We need that tech. We're so reliant on our phones, et cetera, but we don't like the power of these corporations and the individuals that control them. But they have long used certain kinds of strategies, including cozying up to the politicians in Washington, pursuing litigation, regular old lobbying, hanging out with billionaires. It's a long story. I'll just leave it there. I realize we've gone 1 minute over though, Kari, so I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries. This has been really interesting. Thank you so much for this discussion, and also to the audience for sending in such great questions. Unfortunately, we won't be able to get to any more of them, but I will pass them along to you if that's okay, and because they're really interesting. So I'll pass along the rest of the questions. So thanks for sending those to the audience members. And sorry we didn't get to all of them today. But I would like to once again thank both of our guests, Jennifer and Janina, for joining us today and for this wonderful presentation and discussion. And just before leaving you, I would like to announce that our final webinar of this season is June 3rd, and it's with Wolfgang Weiss and Cornelia Frugalita on their new book, Open Strategic Autonomy in EU Trade Policy. You can sign up for that as usual at eu-renew.eu, and pretty soon we'll also post our fall schedule up there. So thanks again for joining us today, Jennifer and Janina, and thank you to the audience as well.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Till next time.